Today's article about the New England colonies is titled Slavery in the New England Colonies. And here we have a picture, although it doesn't look very historical because it's wrapped in plastic. It's all shiny, so I don't think that's an old picture. Let's find out what the meaning is here by reading the caption. It says, Image 1, a sign is displayed outside of Faneuil Hall in Boston, Massachusetts during a slave auction reenactment protest on November 10th, 2018. Oh, of course, this is new, but it's a reenactment of something old. The demonstration called for the building's name to be changed because its namesake's association with the slave trade. So what that means is people were protesting the fact that this building is called Faneuil Hall because Peter Faneuil, whose name you can see at the top of this big poster in the protest, owned and traded slaves. Peter Faneuil, it says, one of the wealthiest merchants in 18th century Boston, remember the 18th century is the 1700s, and responsible for gifting Faneuil Hall, it means he gave Faneuil Hall to the city of Boston, the location of Boston's town meeting in a building nicknamed the Cradle of Liberty, enslaved 5 people. So let me take out the middle part of that sentence. Peter Faneuil, it says, enslaved 5 people. An example of Faneuil's involvement in the slave trade is the voyage he planned to Guinea in 1742 with his ship, the Jolly Bachelor. Faneuil died in 1742, but the ship returned from the Guinea coast in 1743 with 20 enslaved Africans. So let's read about slavery in New England. We often think of slavery in terms of the South and the Civil War, but New England had slaves, many of them, and we're going to learn more about that today. This article comes from National Geographic. Okay, here we go. Let's read. Introduction. Conversations about slavery in America frequently center on the American South and the Civil War. Yet the roots of American slavery go much deeper than that. They extend all the way back to the original British colonies in North America. Some, like New England, would become known for their abolitionist leaders. Abolitionists were people who fought to end slavery. They wanted to abolish slavery. They fought against slavery and helped freed and escaped Southern slaves. However, the New England colonies also had a history of using slave labor to build their economies. So let's learn about that. The origins of American slavery. Origins are the beginnings. The concept of slavery was hardly a new one to the English colonists who first came to America. It had been practiced in Europe for more than 100 years. In 1619, colonists brought enslaved Africans to Virginia. This was the beginning of a slave trade between Africa and North America based on the social norms of Europe. That's like what was accepted in Europe. Slavery grew quickly in the South because of the region's large plantations, large farms that were designed to make money. However, slavery in New England was different. New England did not have large plantations for growing crops. Here, it was more common to have 1 or 2 enslaved people working for a household, a business, or a small farm. Enslaved people often learned special skills and crafts. This section's called New England's Forced Laborers. Part of the reason slavery developed differently in New England was the culture of indentured servitude. So we're going to learn about that. This practice, indentured servitude, also came from England. Indentured servants were often white Europeans working to pay off money they owed. Usually, they had signed a contract to work 4 to 7 years. More than half the population of the American colonies was brought over as indentured servants. New England colonies were also slower to start accepting African slavery in general. One reason for this was that there were alternatives to enslaved Africans. Early on in New England's history, a different kind of slave trade began. Colonists enslaved and shipped local Native Americans to the West Indies and the Caribbean. This kind of slavery was more limited. Nevertheless, it was part of the history of the early New England slave trade. So do you understand what they're saying there? That the colonists who came from England to the New England colonies captured Native Americans and sent them to the Caribbean as slaves. Enslaved Africans quickly replaced indentured servants on plantations in Virginia, Maryland, and other southern colonies. However, that was not the case in New England. At first, enslaved people here had the same rights as indentured servants. That changed in 1641. That year, the Massachusetts Bay Colony passed new slave laws. As a result, enslaved people in the colony lost the few rights they had. So slaves became true slaves and had no rights. Still, the New England colonies began to show differences in how they dealt with slavery. This was true even as slavery became more common in some colonies. For example, Rhode Island tried to enforce laws that would have given certain rights to enslaved people. That colony would have set enslaved people free after 10 years of service. These actions did not bring an end to slavery. However, they were a sign of what was to come in the New England colonies. This section's titled Becoming the Free North, and the Free North is in quotes, so we know it's a title of something. It's a name that comes from somewhere. Let's read to find out where it comes from. The use of slavery throughout the colonies continued to grow throughout the 1700s. As time passed, the colonies moved closer to revolution against England. There was a growing trend of questioning slavery in New England. Enslaved people who fought in the Revolutionary War were offered their freedom. As a result, the number of freed slaves in the region grew. Well, that's a good thing, right? If you fight and risk your life to defend and become your own country, you should be free, shouldn't you? Religious groups like the Quakers began the first anti-slavery movements in New England. These early movements were very important. They would later develop into the abolitionist movements in the 1800s that spread across the United States. New England governments began to step in as well. Connecticut and Rhode Island outlawed active slave trades. That means they banned them, they stopped them. However, few colonial leaders wanted to fully get rid of slavery at the time. It was not until late into the Revolutionary War period that the former New England colonies began outlawing slavery fully. So that's the late 1700s. Vermont was first, followed by Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. And remember, Maine was part of Massachusetts. So when you read Massachusetts, you got to think about Maine too. In 1800, all New England states were free states. Free meaning they didn't allow slavery. And here's our final image. It's an image that some of you might recognize. There she is. It says around the edge, it says Phyllis Wheatley, Negro servant to Mr. John Wheatley of Boston. And the caption says, American poet Phyllis Wheatley, who lived from 1753 to 1784, was bought as a slave by John Wheatley of Boston, Massachusetts. She became an accomplished poet. In 1773, published poems on various subjects, religious and moral. And do you remember where you might have seen or heard of Phyllis Wheatley before? Well, if you played the Mission US game for Crown or Colony, she was sort of an important character in that game because she's a real person and she really was in Boston during that time. And Nathaniel Wheeler, the main character, made friends with her. Okay, so there's the article. Now you're going to take the quiz thoughtfully, do your best, and let me know if you need help.